Hello! In this project I'm going to be making these coasters out of some leftover scraps of wood and some epoxy resin. I tend not to throw things away, and so I've got various tubs around the workshop which I use to collect things in, which I assume might become useful at some point in the future. These tubs, for instance, have got various sizes of bits of hardwood and softwood offcuts from other projects. The first step in this project is to prepare the wood that's going to be the borders for each of the coasters. I'm essentially going to make a tall box, and so I need 4 pieces of equal length. I start by cutting 2 pieces to length off of this piece of sapele. Now this wood is twice the thickness I need it to be, so I'm going to resaw it on the bandsaw. I'm using my thickest blade in the bandsaw to help keep the cuts straight. With the pieces cut to thickness, I use a smoothing plane to remove all of the tool marks. Next I use the table saw. With the blade set at a 45-degree angle, I cut mitres along the long edges of each of the boards. With the mitres cut, the boards will come together to form a tall box. To help construct the box, I use some masking tape. I lay the tape out and then place the boards on it using a straight edge to line up the ends. With the boards in position, I add glue to the mitred edges. I then construct the box by rolling the boards together, allowing the tape to keep everything in position. Once in position, I can secure the box together using the tape. I'll add some rubber bands to help give some clamping pressure while the glue sets. I check for square and make any adjustments where necessary. Once the glue's dry, I can remove the rubber bands and the tape. If the finished project was to make a box of this shape, I'd have to add some splines across the corners to give the finished box some strength. This isn't necessary for this project, as I'm going to be slicing it up into sections. I'm going to take the opportunity now to sand up the outside of the box and to chamfer the edges using a block plane. It's much easier to add this curve now than to try and do it to each individual coaster later on. I need to make a temporary base for the bottom of the box, so I use this old piece of MDF. I mark it up to roughly the right size. And then I cut it to final size. It doesn't need to be an exact fit here. I'm now going to use some duct tape to fix the temporary base to the bottom of the box. I use more duct tape to seal the join between the base and the bottom of the box. The next stage is to start filling the box with some of the scrap material. There's no technical craft to this, it's purely an aesthetic choice. I like to have some of the longer pieces at a slight angle so that each consecutive coaster has a slightly different positioning, but you can see how all the coasters belong to each other. If you wanted a regular pattern, you could cut uniform pieces of wood and ensure they were all perpendicular. But I like this haphazard approach. I filled the box with the scrap wood, so it's on to the next stage. So the next stage is to fill the gaps between the scrap wood with some epoxy resin. The stuff I have here uses 2 parts of the resin to 1 part of the hardener. I'm using some old plastic glasses with a uniform ridge here in order to get my quantities correct. Note that I'm using gloves here whilst handling this, and I have the main door open to provide some good ventilation. I take the measures of the resin and the hardener and add them to a 4th larger container for mixing. The resin and hardener need mixing together well to ensure that the substance goes off properly. At this stage I'm going to add some pigment to the resin mix. I'm using some blue here. It's a powder pigment. Again, it needs thoroughly mixing in. I add the pigment a little at a time until the colour is my required shade. Once the resin is thoroughly mixed, I can start to pour it into the wooden box. I pour it in a little at a time, giving the resin plenty of time to sink down to the bottom and to fill in all the gaps. It's important that there's enough time for the air trapped at the bottom to escape up through the resin. I had to mix some more resin to fill the container completely. This box is about 9 inches high and 4 inches in diameter. In total it took just over a pint of resin to fill in all the gaps. Here we can see bubbles starting to form on the resin as air trapped lower down the box starts to find its way out. I leave the box for 2 to 3 days to fully harden. Once hardened, I can remove the tape and remove the base. In hindsight, I should have covered the entirety of the outside of the box in duct tape or painter's tape to protect it from drips from the resin. However, it doesn't take much effort with the belt sander to remove any resin drips and bits that have pooled around the base. I use a small detail sander to remove any last stubborn bits of resin. I check for square and mark up the squarest of the edges. I'll make sure I use this edge on the bandsaw table. I had a thin blade in my bandsaw from another project I was working on simultaneously, so I swapped this out for a thicker blade to give me more accuracy while making the slices. First of all, I cut the uneven top off of the box. This gives me something square to reference against the fence for cutting the rest of the slices. I then set my fence to the desired width and start cutting slices of coaster. And there's my first coaster. I then repeat this process until I run out of box. After allowing for waste at the top and bottom, I end up with 16 coasters. A few of the coasters from nearer the bottom of the box have got some air bubbles in, so I mix up some glue and some sawdust in order to fill these. I keep these tubs on my bench, which I fill up with sawdust every time I make some. I've got a mixture of various different grades and colours from different woods. Here I've chosen a lighter colour. Once the glue's hardened, I can use a sander to flatten everything down. I sand all the coasters on both sides to remove any tool marks. Next, using a quick squirt of window cleaner and some fine grit wet and dry paper, I polish out the coasters. I'm using a 1500 grit glass paper here. I then bevel all the edges of each of the coasters using the block plane and use sandpaper to give it a final smoothing. This seems like a laborious task because there are 16 coasters with 8 edges each, but actually once I've got everything in the right position it becomes fairly mechanical and it only took me a few minutes. With everything sanded, I then put a decent amount of Danish oil on both sides of each coaster. The oil won't soak into the resin of course, but a lot of the scrap wood on the inside is showing its end grain, so the oil will soak nicely into that and bring out the colours of all the different types of wood. The oil is allowed to dry overnight. I wipe off any excess oil which is on the surface of the resin. I then use a spray varnish to give each coaster a robust finish. I put 3 coats of varnish on in total, and between each layer I give a gentle rub down with some high-grade glass paper. And here are the finished coasters. If you enjoyed this video, check out our channel for some of our other projects, and hit subscribe to keep up to date with new ones.